Hi everyone, my name is Maria.
And my name's Lexia.
And we are part of Y4Y, and we're going to be giving a two-part workshop series on how to work with youth in vulnerable situations. The workshop will be split into two parts.
Part 1 will give the viewers some background information and insight on what might be going on in the life and mind of a youth in a vulnerable situation that would potentially affect certain interactions with them.
Part 2 will help the viewer work on and build their skills surrounding working with vulnerable youth. There is an accompanying workbook. Feel free to follow along using that.
To begin part 1, it's important to understand the population we're working with and talking about. So we're going to start by defining what vulnerable youth actually means. Generally, these youth have experienced some adverse conditions which subjects them to emotional, mental, and physical barriers or stress. This doesn't necessarily mean that when a youth experiences an adverse condition that they'll develop behavioral issues. However, the more adversity a youth faces, the more likely it will promote certain behaviors, classifying them as high-risk youth. It's extremely important to note and keep in mind throughout this entire workshop and through every interaction that every person is different. Everyone and every behavior will differentiate on a case-to-case basis. There is no set equation on how to deal with all youth.
Okay, so we're going to start with our first activity. Let's assess your existing knowledge. So how do you think vulnerable youth will behave in different situations? Take a few minutes to write in your workbook or brainstorm with the people around you to come up with some behaviors that you might think might be common among these youth. It is estimated that this activity will take about 2 minutes. You can press pause now and press play once you're finished.
We'll be going through a few common themes that may be seen within these youth. Generally, underage substance use sometimes occurs. Sometimes these youth will begin to use drugs or alcohol while underage for different reasons. It may be because they're trying to cope with something, or maybe they're familiar with it and it's something they've been around a lot. Or it may very well be for a completely different reason. This can be dangerous as it can interfere with their day-to-day functioning and have detrimental effects not only on their brain development, but also on their emotional and social development. The useful tools that they would learn while interacting with their environment is greatly interfered with when under the influence. They may also develop a tendency to increase their frequency of use or maybe seek out more potent substances. This can lead to an addiction that may persist well into adulthood. It can be useful to understand what kind of side effects may be seen with youth under the influence. Therefore, in your workbook, there's a table including different categories of substances, the examples of common substances within these categories, as well as the common side effects that may be seen with these substances. You can refer to this to familiarize yourself with this while approaching a youth who may be under the influence. Another theme is youth may be impulsive, but also resistant to change. They also may jeopardize their safety. Oftentimes, these youth tend to dismiss their well-being and have low impulse control, leading them to engage in their impulsive desires. It's not uncommon to see youth engage in what might be considered risky or dangerous. Despite being impulsive, though, they may also be resistant to change as they become comfortable with what they are familiar with. A very important and prominent theme here is that most times they often struggle to identify healthy relationships, especially with adults. They have had several bad, disappointing experiences, especially with adults. They also may have grown up not exposed to healthy attachments or relationships. So when they're making their own relationships, it becomes difficult to recognize and form healthy ones. They also tend to generalize, so this causes a rigidity of perception. Along these lines, they also struggle with authority and have a hard time trusting. They may have had, again, multiple bad, hurtful, or disappointing experiences with authority figures in their lives, whether they felt betrayed, let down, or scared. For these reasons, they may struggle to trust anyone and seen as an authority figure. Working hand in hand with this, some may have developed a mindset where they need to fend for themselves. This can lead to difficulty in relying on others, but also trusting others' intentions. So what you can do is be flexible and be patient and take time to build trust. Lastly, they also sometimes experience symptoms of anxiety, depression, traits of personality disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, although may not actually having the illness itself. So be compassionate and mindful.
Okay, so this next activity can be done alone or in groups of two. If you're doing it in a group of two, person one is going to clench their fists. Adopt the mindset that your fist needs to stay closed or something bad might happen to you. Person two is going to try to convince this person to make them feel comfortable to open their fists. Now in your workbooks, write down what you might have said to make that person feel comfortable enough to open their fists. And if you were in the other position, write down what was said to you or what could have been said to you to help you open your fists. If you're working alone, please write down what you might say to convince someone or make them feel comfortable enough to open their fists. It's estimated that this activity will take you about 3 minutes. You can press pause now and play once you're finished. When you're working with youth in vulnerable positions, they may feel closed off and unsure of you. I'd like to think that you all spoke to your partner gently, encouraging them and showing them care and empowerment. This is how you should approach these youth. Those of you who didn't open your fist and were tempted to, or maybe did, you've taken the position of the youth in this case. Adapt to the environment and to the youth you'll be working with. Maybe slow the pace or change your tone. Okay, now take a few minutes to pause and take a break. You can go to the bathroom, have a coffee, and we'll meet back here shortly.
So now that we're aware of the common themes and behaviors to look out for among youth, we can move on to another extremely important piece to understand: why they may behave this way. It's important to go into these settings with an open mind and a willingness to understand youth without judgment, rather than judging their current situations and current behaviors. Getting down to the basics, there is an interaction between somebody's genes and somebody's environment, affecting the way we approach and perceive things. In your workbook, you'll find a diagram of a seed, a tree, and an environment. The seed represents your genes. The environment represents the environment that one is in. And then the tree represents a person. The way the tree will develop, whether it be luscious or small and withered, depends on the climate of one's environment, as well as somebody's genes that they are provided with. One can't really change their genes or the predispositions they may have. However, many aspects within their environment can change to affect one's perception. Two major aspects in the environment is trauma, but also relationships that one has with other people.
So starting with trauma. Trauma usually means a serious threat, actual or perceived, to your safety and life. Experiencing trauma does not necessarily mean someone will develop PTSD, but it may very likely have some sort of impact on the way a youth approaches life. Traumatic events include abuse, which can be sexual, physical, emotional, or psychological, or violence, medical trauma, accidents, disasters, or a traumatic loss.
Moving on to relationships with others, we come to attachment styles. Firstly, what is an attachment and where does it begin to form? So attachment is an emotional bond. In childhood, this forms between the child and their caregivers through their interactions, but also the caregiver's response to the child's distress. This is important to discuss, as understanding what a youth may have experienced with the closest people in their life can provide some insight into their behaviors and their perceptions of relationships with others, especially with adults, and views toward building the relationships with others. In your workbook, again, you'll find a table with the different attachment styles, the environment which the person was in to have developed this attachment, also the thoughts that someone with these certain attachment styles may think, as well as the behaviors that people with these attachment styles will exhibit or may exhibit. There are 4 main attachment styles: secure, ambivalent, avoidant, and disorganized. With a secure attachment, caregivers were usually loving, consistently available, sensitive, affectionate, and accepting and comforting. With this, a youth might feel worthy of love and affection, find value in relationships, and understand the impact that their actions have on others. With avoidant attachment, Caregivers may have been rejecting, unavailable emotionally, or ignored and was annoyed by the child's distress. Youth here may dismiss relationships and not feel worthy of love. They may also focus their attention away from their attachment and away from the figures in their lives, and fail to believe that anyone is there for them. With ambivalent attachment, caregivers were inconsistent in their response to the child. They were also heightening the child's anxiety based on their behaviors, and they were insensitive to their children in need. They also had unrealistic expectations. This may lead a youth to feel like they're never good enough, but needing to please others. They may also be distressed. Lastly, with a disorganized attachment, caregivers were very unpredictable and scary to the child. Here, a youth may feel unsafe, anxious, and not trust others easily.
How are these attachment styles seen, and how may youth with different types of attachment styles behave? What is their temperament? So individuals with a secure attachment style may be resilient, secure in themselves, cooperative, resourceful, content, engaged, and on task. Individuals with an avoidant attachment style may be hostile, provoke rejection, isolated, dismissive, withdrawn, anxious, and quiet. Individuals with an ambivalent attachment style can be attention-seeking, easily frustrated, impulsive, passive, helpless, and insecure. Individuals with a disorganized attachment style can have difficulty regulating emotions, oppositional, aggressive, low self-esteem, controlling, unpredictable, have intense emotions, be scared of rejection, have difficulty trusting, desire closeness, but have difficulty achieving it and sometimes are scared of it.
So now we have an activity. Here you can identify which attachment style fits best with each of the following scenarios, and think about how you may adjust your demeanor in approaching a youth in these situations. You'll have approximately 16 minutes to go through all 4 scenarios. Pause the workshop after each scenario and then play once you are finished answering. All right, so now that you have finished the activity, I will be giving you the correct answers. You can take a moment to write them down in your workbook. So scenario 1 was an avoidant attachment. Scenario 2 was an ambivalent attachment. Scenario 3 was secure. And scenario 4 was disorganized. In the next part of the workshop, part 2, we will touch on what skills to adopt when approaching youth in situations like these.
Interaction between genes and environments cause us to react to different situations in different ways. Experiencing adverse situations commonly affects one's sensitivity to stress and threat, meaning they may no longer be able to perceive and react to threats in a healthy way. One's ability to process/interpret social information, making some interactions more difficult. One's ability to empathize with others. The ability to regulate emotions, and may be causing some unhealthy reactions to situations. And the capacity to seek support and comfort. When these processes and abilities are affected, it is completely understandable that the individual may perceive more of a threat than there actually is. Evidently, there will be an impact on their relationships with the people around them if social information processes and the ability to empathize is affected. Struggling with emotional regulation can lead someone to feel emotions very intensely or atypically, which can impact their behaviors and approaches to situations. It is important to understand that we cannot expect cooperation at all times, and need to respect the fact that youth may hesitate and may be uncertain in certain situations and speaking with new people.
Helping them feel like they're in a safe space can help them let their guard down, and it will help the interaction with these youth flow better. Ways you can do this is set limits and boundaries, not only for yourself but also for the youth. You can be available when they're needed, particularly during conflict or distress. You can maintain predictability and consistency, This is important for a youth to be able to count on you and your presence and help build some sort of trust. You can also show that they are valued. This can be done by being attentive to them, by validating their emotions, and you can help them do the same as well. You can also have realistic expectations and be patient with them.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the case studies. So we'll have different members from the community come in who are professionals in the mental health field and speak about some of their experiences in working with youth. So now we will have guest speaker Tony tell you about a case they have encountered while working with youth in vulnerable positions. Think about how you might handle this situation. Discussion questions will follow.
Hi, my name is Tony. My pronouns are he, him. I am a outreach coordinator at a local community organization here in Montreal. I've been working with youth intervention work and just general work with youth for about 20 years now. I'm going to give you a little case study that I had, and maybe you can have some thinking about it, do some thinking about it. So this case study is a 17-year-old woman. She is a Black woman who lives in the Point St. Charles neighborhood. She lived in the Point St. Charles neighborhood down in Montreal. That neighborhood is unique in that there are no high schools in that neighborhood. So everybody from that neighborhood has to go out of their own neighborhood to go to school, which is pretty terrible when you think about success in life in terms of academics. Not being able to get to school easily and not having your schoolmates be people that live close to you. Those are all things that factor into success in high school. This specific case, her name is Jennifer. We'll call her Jennifer. She lived with her mom, a single mother, and she had issues with a history of substance abuse, her mother and her, both. There was general neglect in the house. The mother was around when she could be for various reasons. She was not around often. So Jennifer was stuck taking care of herself, probably since she was in her early teenage years, or tween years, I guess you could say. She was solo a lot, which is why she got into this history of substance abuse. In my work with her, my goal was to get her into school and to graduate. That was it. That was all we wanted her to do, finish high school. If you don't know about Quebec, it has a very low graduation rate. And when you start talking about impoverished neighborhoods and at-risk communities, those numbers are even worse. So that was my job. Let's try to get you into school. Spoiler, she did not graduate high school, but we'll talk about that in a bit. In my work with her, she was regularly using alcohol, hard drugs, soft drugs, party drugs. She was going out with people much older than her. Also, she wasn't doing sex work per se, but she wasn't not doing sex work. So that is kind of like, it was this gray area where she didn't consider herself a sex worker, but she was trading sex for drugs and money. So, that's, it's perception. But she was doing what she needed to do to get by. There's no judgment in that case, just that's what she had to do. Or in any case, people do what they need to do. So she was at extreme risk of not graduating, which is why she was assigned to me, or we got together. She was super smart. Every time she went to school, straight A's. She didn't have to study. She didn't have to do anything. But the hard part was getting to school. With her mother not home, she would never go to school. When her mother was home, it was 50-50 whether or not her mom would make her go to school or whether she would just sit at home or go out and just be a person out in the world. When I worked with her, I tried to take what's called a harm reduction approach. So harm reduction means that people are making informed decisions about what they're doing with their life and how they are proceeding. So in terms of drug use, that means making sure, I'm not saying don't do drugs. I'm saying if you're gonna do drugs, make sure you know how they affect you, make sure you know what you're taking, and make sure you're not doing it alone. These are kind of like the core principles of harm reduction in terms of drug use. For her, she was not taking a harm reductive approach. She was just doing what she could, when she could, how she could. And there wasn't any consistency. She would go on a bender for a week, and then she would do no drugs for 2 months, and then go back on for another week, and then go off for a week and do a few days. It was a lot of up and down in terms of her drug use. Alcohol, however, was an everyday thing. When we were talking, we would often talk about how she could get to school and why she wasn't going to school. School was our primary focus. But she said she would drink because she was trying to kind of smother her emotions around what was going around in the house and what was going on in school, and because people knew what she was doing outside of school, her classmates and stuff like that. So she would just drink every night to kind of forget, I guess you could say. And so in terms of my approach, I tried to take this harm reduction approach, but also a holistic approach. A holistic approach means looking at everything, not just looking at mental health, right? She was definitely needed to be seeing a therapist. She can't afford it. That's just the reality of the world that she lived in. So if I was just only looking at something that she couldn't get help for, I'd be stuck. We would never get anywhere. So I was trying to take a holistic approach in terms of what things she could change in her life that would affect her mental health, that would affect her ability to go to school, and just kind of looking at everything in a big picture, right? And so that meant try not drinking every night, or cutting down on how much she was drinking every night. And then also looking at preparing her clothes in the day before, right? And if there was no laundry, how would she be able to get to do laundry? How would she get to do money? Things like this that affect her mental health and her everyday living, but looking at the big picture. I'm not just looking at, okay, you need a therapist, let's get you a therapist, because that wasn't even an option for her. I did a lot of intervention work with her in the sense that I would often walk her to school. It was kind of patronizing though, and I stopped doing that because I could tell that she was embarrassed. I was able to meet her for coffee in the mornings, and that would be able to get her up and out of the house, and she was much more likely to go to school when she had coffee with me than if she hadn't. Again, she's 17. She's basically graduating. She was at her last year of school. She should have. She's an adult. In Quebec, you only go to school till you're about 17, and then you start, or high school till you're 17, and then you start CEGEP. The CEGEP system is 2 years. She had no plans for what she wanted to do after high school. She was just happy doing what she was doing, which was just living and surviving. In terms of approaches I didn't take that I could have taken, there's Child Protective Services in Quebec. Once you hit 18, they literally give you a garbage bag and they say, of your stuff, and they say, here you go, and go out into the world. They don't really prepare you for leaving foster homes and that sort of thing. So that was not an option I wanted to take. I felt like that would have been more detrimental. She had some kind of structure in the sense that she had a house, a home that she could live in, and she had a community of friends. Whether they were good or bad influences at this point didn't matter. She would have been taken from all of that, which I think would have been worse. Some people would say, well, why didn't you call the cops? I don't call the cops. Think about how that affects people, especially in low-income communities. The police try to help. Oftentimes, they end up making situations worse. What if her mom gets arrested? What if she gets arrested? Then what? So she's in jail. How's she going to do anything? She can't do anything good that way. I mean, if she was having a mental health crisis at a moment when the cops came, we know the history of police and their track record with people in mental health crisis, so that was not a position I was willing to put the family in, period. And then the other option is forced institutionalization, putting them to a psychiatric ward. She had a patient or rehab facility. I didn't think that was the best option. Yes, she could have benefited from it, but because it wasn't consistent and it wasn't to the point where she was a danger to herself, not everybody has to graduate high school. It's ideal. That's what we want you to do. But there are plenty of people who have been successful in their lives who haven't graduated high school. So, like I said in the beginning, she didn't graduate high school. Does that mean I didn't do my job? I don't know. I think I did as good as I could do given the circumstances that I was in and the circumstances that she was in and her family was in. So failure, success, these are things that we have to think about all the time in this field. And I think that if we're doing everything that we can, then that's a success. Making sure we're not sitting back and focusing too much on what didn't work and learning from it, but also focusing on what did work and using that to move forward. So maybe you could take a few moments and reflect on the following discussion questions. They're going to pop up on the screen. You can pause, you can do whatever you need to do, write them down, and then you can continue the video afterwards.
Now we will have guest speaker Kat tell you about a situation that they've encountered while working with vulnerable youth. Think about how you might handle the situation. Discussion questions will follow.
Hi, my name is Kat. I'm a youth counselor and I currently work at a nonprofit organization that caters to youth 12 to 25 years of age. And my organization is really big on harm reduction and providing an environment where youth can feel like they're the agents of their own lives. And like we really believe that regardless of the substances that they use, we just want to provide them with as much information as possible. And so harm reduction in general is a big value of my organization. So the case study that I'm presenting today revolves a little bit around that. My organization also prioritizes marginalized youth, so at any intersection, whether that be race, socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, we just try to cater to youth that need services the most. So can I go into my case study? So the case study I'm presenting to you revolves around a Black queer trans youth, 20 years of age. They use substances to manage their mental health symptoms, and they've experienced strained family relationships that has led to a lack of social support currently, and this youth is currently working. So the situation goes as follows. You're working with a Black client that has been referred to you by a CLSC social worker after struggling to find housing and employment following a period of homelessness. Prior to this, the client lost the financial support of their family due to their family disagreeing with their sexuality, gender identity, and personal views. When referred to you, the client has now found a sublet and a stable job. During the first few sessions, you established with the client that they would like their major therapeutic goal would be to have support managing their symptoms of anxiety, depression, and grief related to the loss of their family support system. And the client mentions that they continue to worry whether they will be able to ensure their survival if they can't manage their symptoms of anxiety and depression, especially now that they have no one else to really rely on. If their mental health declines, all of the financial brunt of their life really falls on them. So it's pretty rough. As the sessions progress, you begin to notice that the client is spending much more of the session time discussing how they will acquire their next dose of a substance that helps them feel relaxed, while also blurring their memory at times and diverting their attention away from their worried thoughts regarding their survival. This pattern differs from previous sessions where the client would mention the substance from time to time and seemed more willing to explore personal themes outside of this topic, like practicing coping skills and just talking about their feelings in general. So during one session in particular, the client mentions that they missed several days of work to find a way to acquire the substance and only returned to work once they did. They then expressed feeling great distress because they were beginning to worry that their employer may let them go following this period of absence. So this is how I intervened with this client, and I'm going to describe it in a bit of a point form matter that kind of gives you a sense of like my values as a counselor and how I approached this, how I would approach this situation. So first of all, depending on my relationship with the client and depending on how anxious or defensive they may feel around the use of this particular substance, I may bring attention to the shift in their behavior, meaning the shift from talking about the willingness to talk about more personal themes, and now a shift towards like really talking about how can I get my next dose of this substance. So I'll bring attention to the shift, perhaps. I'll say, I've noticed that you spend more time talking about this substance in our sessions than you previously do. Do you agree with this? And my intention, depending on their response, is to really focus on their views and feelings surrounding the shift. It's not me imposing what I think, it's really exploring how they feel about this. And I may ask, can you tell me about how you feel or what you think about this? How does this feel in your body when you talk about this substance or when you talk about worrying about acquiring your next dose? And if the client is defensive, I stop. Support, respect, validate, hold space, and soothe, because this is why they're here. My job is to provide soothing and healing presence for them. If they lose my support, they no longer have that support. And so if they become defensive, they're not ready to have this conversation, and I stop. And I return to my previous supportive, validating, respectful stance. And if they're not defensive, and if they're willing and open to explore this topic, depending on my relationship with the client and their response to the previous question, I continue further with the questions that follow. I may highlight and validate their response to distress. So I may say, the substance seems to be helping you feel calm, and that is something that you said that you really wanted, that you need. You seem to have found a way to soothe your distress, and you've been dealing with so much. I understand wanting to reduce some of that stress, and it can be so hard to carry alone, so I understand why you may need to feel what this substance allows you to feel. So I'm highlighting their response to the situation. I'm highlighting a strength. I'm highlighting the fact that they've tried to find a way to cope with the stress that they're feeling, which is overwhelming and unfortunate. I may also begin to ask, depending on their openness to explore this, I may ask, how do you feel about your relationship with this substance? How do you feel about the frequency? How do you feel about the dosage? How do you feel? I may also ask, how do you think it would look like for your relationship with this substance to become less than ideal or unsafe? In other words, if your relationship with this substance becomes less than ideal or unsafe, what would that look like in your eyes? What would happen? Walk me through a day of what it looks like for your relationship with this substance to become less than ideal. And can you outline some of the signs that would appear? And then I would follow up depending on how this lands with them. If any of these signs appear in your behavior with this substance while we're working together, would you want me to let you know? I'm asking for their consent. I'm asking for their consent for me to intervene if they feel that their relationship with this substance becomes problematic according to their standards. I would also follow up with, how would it feel for you to acquire some more knowledge on how to manage your use of this substance? So I'm upholding the values of my organization, which is harm reduction. If they would like more information on how to manage their use of this substance in a way that is more ideal with them reaching the goals that they want to reach, then we have all sorts of information at the organization that I work at to help them achieve that. So yeah, this is how I would intervene in this situation. And one of the reasons why I respond this way is because it's important for me to let the client know that, hey, I'm not here to judge you about what or how you use. I believe you're the best person to know what you need and how you need to manage stress in any given situation. You're the best person to know that and know what you need. And I want to uphold that for you. And another reason why I intervene this way is because if they lose the therapeutic alliance that we've created, this client has no social support, and then they become more at risk for so many other factors that will not be good for them. They won't be protected, they won't have someone to talk to, they won't have this service. And so approaching it in this way, with this kind of care, makes sure that they don't lose what it is that they're coming for, which is a soothing therapeutic alliance. So feel free to pause this video and consider the following discussion question, and you can return when you're ready.
That brings us to the end of part 1 of our workshop that included some background information to keep in mind while interacting with these youth. In part 2, we will begin to develop skills that you can adopt while working with them. Thank you for listening to part 1, and we look forward to seeing you in part 2.
We would love to stay connected with you via Y4Y's ever-growing social media presence. Connect with us on any of the following platforms to hear more about upcoming events, initiatives, and workshops. Thank you.